So I think it's only natural that I start today off by talking about what's been taking up a huge chunk of my time lately, and that's editing the novel. So I've been watching a lot of Jenna Moresi lately, and specifically when it comes to editing, and I've sort of lifted her editing process, and I'm trying it out with this with my first novel. So the first phase that and I'll link to the video where she outlines everything, because I don't want to take credit for her process. The first phase that she outlines involves focusing on the structure of the novel, so as much on a chapter-to-chapter basis as the acts and the whole novel. And you also just sort of highlight all the little things that don't work, like word choice and sections that need compressing and redundant sentences, that kind of thing. I finished that first part Sunday, and now I've started the actual rewrites, and I'm right now completely stuck on the first chapter. When I did the read-through, I knew the first chapter was going to need the most work because it was about 20 pages long, which was more than 3 times longer than any other chapter in the book. And also just had a lot of things that didn't work. So I took the axe to a lot of it. And now it's looking like it's the right length. But now the challenge I'm having is in trying to put in the right amount of exposition, because I still have to sort of describe how this world works and describe the main thread of the story. And that got me thinking about putting in a prologue, which I'm a bit reticent to do because it's such a cliche of fantasy novels to have a prologue. But at the same time, I think it'd be a good tool to sort of give context to the story before it actually kicks off. So I'm trying to figure out this first chapter now, and it's encouraging in some ways. It's also discouraging. It's encouraging because as I look at the first chapter and realize everything that's wrong with it, I can see that I've become a better writer. Because when I wrote the first chapter, it was the first bit of the first draft of this novel. I thought it was great. I was proud of my fight scenes. I was proud of the structure of it. I was proud of the whole thing. But then now that I'm actually taking a chance to look back at it, I realize essentially what the problems with it are. And that's a good thing to know, that I'm making progress. The one thing that's discouraging is that I feel like I haven't made enough progress, because as I'm trying to figure it out and rework it, it's not going the way I'd like it to. I'm sitting there staring at this thing like, how am I going to hammer this into something that makes sense, into something that works? And I think I'm sort of on the right track finally. I mean, I've been working on this since Monday. It's only been 3 days, but still, when you're used to working quickly, which from the writing the first draft and the first edit, I think I can say that I work pretty quickly. It's frustrating to get stuck on this one part, especially considering there's all this other stuff to do. I remind myself that this is one of the bigger chunks. I think the opening and closing chapters are a lot more important than most of the other chapters. So I have to sort of give myself the time to get it right. And I'm hoping to have at least the first rewrite of the first chapter done by the end of this week. Because if I spend a week on each chapter, I mean, that's like 30 weeks. It's a long time. So I'm thinking that in order to sort of progress, I'm going to rewrite this first chapter once, then keep moving through the book, and then come back to it. Because I'm getting this sort of sneaking sensation that I could easily just get straight up stuck on it. But overall, the read-through went pretty well. I mean, I highlighted a ton of things that needed work, and I took a bunch of notes to, because this is what I've been doing, is I've been both highlighting in the printed manuscript, and I've also been writing notes in a separate notebook about problems with the chapters and the acts, so that I've got things to look back on and I remember the changes that need to happen. So the first chapter has more than a page of notes of things that are wrong with it, and there's not really any other chapter that has the same amount of notes. So at least as far as I can tell now, the rest of the book doesn't need nearly as much work as the first chapter. So I just have to make sure I get the first chapter right, and then I can progress and get the rest of it right. It's funny because when you start out as a writer, you sort of imagine that sitting down to write is the hardest thing you have to do. It's a real irony in that I love what I do, but actually sitting down to do it feels like a chore sometimes. And I think it's like Muhammad Ali said he hated every minute of training, but he did it because he knew that's what he needed to be a champion. And I think the parallel to that is, as a writer, I don't hate every minute of writing. If I did, I wouldn't be doing this, and I shouldn't be doing this. But there are some days where I really have to force everything that comes out, and I have to force myself to write, really. And in those days, you sort of wonder, am I really a writer? Is this what I need to be doing? Should it be this hard? And then the joke is, you're done the first, when you've finished writing the actual thing, then you have to edit, and then you find out that's actually the hardest thing that you have to do. When I started editing this, I have had thoughts of this novel's garbage, and I should just throw it aside and do something else, do anything else. But it would be inherently disrespectful to not only all the work I've done, but to myself and to the story, to not try to do the best I can with it before deciding whether I'm going to discard it or not. Because there's always this possibility that it will end up being total trash and I'll have to get rid of it because it's not what I wanted it to be. I hope not. I hope that's not the case. I hope this ends up being my debut novel. That's what I really want. But I have to make peace with the fact that that might not be the case. And I have to accept that even if this novel doesn't get published, just in writing it and just in working through it, I've made myself a better writer than that. I didn't waste any of that time. It's like, how much time does a basketball player spend training before they play in their first NBA game? And it doesn't mean that all that time of training has gone to waste. That's precisely what got them to that first game. And in writing, we have to treat this similarly. All the writing you do, no matter how terrible it is, just prepares you for what comes next. All those words that make you shake your head and cry and frustrate and make you so frustrated, they all lead to something better. They all lead to the next thing. It's like Hemingway said, you sit at a typewriter and bleed, and that's what writing really feels like. It feels like you're letting so much that's inside yourself out onto the page. Whether it's for the world to see or not, you sort of bring it to a place where you can observe it and be critical of it. And that's a really hard thing to do, because when you keep these things inside yourself, the criticism doesn't hit as hard, but once they're given form, once they're actualized, they're easier to criticize, and those words hit a lot harder. Even in just working on my first book, I'm noticing a lot of things that probably stop a lot of other writers from getting to where they want to be. I think there are a lot of people who want to be writers, who never publish anything, and not because they're not good enough, but because they give up in the places where others haven't. Maybe that's what makes you a writer, because with writing there's so many times when at least I tell myself, maybe I'm not really a writer, maybe I should go do something else. But I think being a writer just means not giving up in those places where others would. Because everybody can write things down, but not everyone can write. I think there's a lot of things that go into writing, this sort of perfect storm of factors that not only make you see the world in a way that's different from everybody else, because we don't want to read things from people who see the world exactly as we do, because then there's nothing really interesting about it. I think we read the works of great writers because they sort of simultaneously capture things we're familiar with, but paint them in a different light than what we're used to. I mean, there's only so many types of stories we can tell, and yet there's an infinite amount of fiction and non-fiction. Let's not, be an elitist or be exclusive here. There's a limited amount of stories to be told, but there's infinite works to be read. I think part of that is because there are so many people in this world with such varying degrees of perception and opinion and thought that you can pick up two books about the same thing, but if they're written by two different people, you can get a vastly different experience. And I think that's what we want from writing. And I think that's why, to be a successful writer, you sort of have to write the way only you can. I often joke with my friends that I'm going to be the next Stephen King because I want to write as much as he does. And that's one thing I really admire in him, is how much he writes. But at the same time, it's not possible for me to be the next Stephen King, and I don't think I would want to be anyway. Because if I were to just sort of copy what he does and try to write in a similar style to his, nobody's going to want to read that because they've seen it already. But at the same time, I couldn't write anything that comes anywhere close to being decent writing. Because to write something worth reading, you have to write it as yourself. You have to write like no one else is watching. It's kind of a bastardization of a common trope, but I think it's very appropriate, because a lot of people will write with this thought process of, oh, I can't put this in there because people are going to think X, or oh, I can't do this because people are going to say Y. I think the limit of consideration for your readers is, are they going to understand this? That keeps you from boring them with too much exposition or coming up with some convoluted mystery just because you want to pat yourself on the back when it's resolved because it's so complicated and mysterious. But I don't think you should ever tell yourself, oh, I'm not going to write this in because people are going to think poorly of me, or because they're going to find it very strange. I think all writing is a little bit strange. We're looking at the world around us, and it sort of informs our thoughts that we then conjure onto the page using words that everybody knows, and then we reread them dozens of times to get them to sound just right. Writing in itself is a very strange process, yet it's at the core of so many things that we enjoy. Maybe that means writers are all a little bit strange. At least I feel like I'm a little bit strange. But if I wasn't, I don't think I'd be able to do this. Everyone who did something even a little worthwhile was a little bit strange, a little bit different. And that's what put them in a place where they could achieve the thing they were meant to do. I mean, a perfect case study of this is H.P. Lovecraft, who was a very strange, somewhat shitty human being who wrote these tales that were so different, and he was so strange, and his story is so different that he wasn't even successful in while he was alive. But I mean, he created a whole genre, and there's so many imitators. They're not all imitators. I think some of them are imitators because they can't really write anything of their own. But there's a lot of people who use this genres, like it was just Western or fantasy. I mean, Lovecraftian fiction has become a genre of its own that people sort of play with and write in. And there's something sad about the fact that this man whose fiction wasn't appreciated the way it should have been in life has created this legacy and this boggles the mind. I don't even have the words for it. I mean, let's put it super simply. When he was alive, nobody gave a shit about his words, and then now after his death, there's a Lovecraft legacy, a Lovecraft empire. You can find not only the actual characters and words of Lovecraft, but the influence in so many things. And if he hadn't been strange to the end, hadn't been himself to the end, and if he played it safe, we wouldn't have any of that. It's a bit tragic that he didn't get to enjoy any of the success that his stories earned over time, but still, I hope that if he could see what his fiction has become, that he wouldn't want to do anything differently. Well, I've made it now, and I'm going to head into work. So, see you guys next week.